Hello. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Rick de Vos. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Rick at these events over the last however many years, and we've also become fast friends on Twitter, if that's such a thing, largely bonding over the tennis, of all things. Rick, he's a stalwart of the Australasian Animal Studies Association board, where he does the often thankless task of membership. And so we all owe him a great debt for bringing in the money that allows these kind of events to happen. So I'm sure that his keynote is going to be a wonderful one, and we're very happy that the New Zealand Centre for Human Animal Studies, that he's talking on his particular topic, which is Sea Country, Ruling the Waves and Histories of Fish in Uncertain Times. Rick conducts research in anthropogenic extinction, in particular its cultural and historical significance and the way that it's articulated and practiced. He's an adjunct research fellow at the Centre for Culture and Technology at Curtin University in Western Australia, and before that he coordinated the Research and Graduate Studies programme at the Centre for Aboriginal Studies in Curtin. He's a member of the Extinction Studies Working Group. He's published essays on extinction in Knowing Animals, Animal Death, Extinction Studies, Stories of Time, Death and Generations, and the Edinburgh Companion to Animal Studies, as well as in the Animal Studies Journal, Cultural Studies Review, and AB Autobiography Studies. With Matthew Trulou, he has edited a special issue of Cultural Studies Review this year entitled Extinction Studies, Stories of Unravelling and Reworking, and I'm sure you're all happy to welcome him to talk about his topic today.
Kia ora, Nick. Tēnā koutou katoa. I want to start just to say that I feel it's a great privilege and honour to speak to you today, especially in this context. Looking around, I'm looking at about 60 or 70 people, which I would say is on average about 50 to 55 more than I normally get at my conference paper presentations. So I'm very grateful for that. I want to thank the New Zealand Centre for Human Animal Studies for hosting this conference, but more importantly for their generosity and welcoming as well. I want to thank them, as well as the Australasian Animal Studies Association and my wonderful colleagues on that committee for supporting me to come here today. Without that, I could not have come, so I'm very grateful for that. I also want to thank the conference organising committee for all their hard work. It's something I really appreciate. And to thank Janine Tamati Elif for the mihi whakato yesterday as well. That's something I really appreciate. And finally, just to single out a couple of people, I want to thank Professor Annie Potts for just her graciousness and generosity and encouragement personally as well. And I know that's how a lot of colleagues and students feel about her as well. She's somebody I really respect, and that with her work, and that would be enough, but she also happens to be such a lovely person as well. And she had to do a little bit of work to encourage me to come, because I didn't quite understand what it meant to be invited to, and for a start I was dismissing the idea. And I'd also like to thank Professor Philip Armstrong. He's busy. Oh, okay. I met Phil 15 years ago here in Tautahi at a cultural studies conference, and it was where I first got to hear Annie and Phil deliver papers for the first time, but just through him, he introduced himself to me, talk about his work, and it really helped me to think about animal studies and literature and a different pathway in thinking about what I was doing. I was involved in theatre and drama and performance studies before then, so it really did help kind of crystallised my vision to move on in terms of, paying more attention and critical attention to non-human animals. This paper today is in part instigated by the challenges presented by animal studies scholars who've engaged with fish as beings, with whom we live and from whom we benefit, who we exploit, and with whom we face ethical demands. Jonathan Bolcom has argued that fish deserve our moral concern, given the clear evidence that they are autonomous, sentient individuals living sophisticated lives, evidence constantly occluded by restricting stereotypes. Dinesh Wadawal has challenged us as scholars, given the obstacles to fish welfare prompted by an unprecedented rise in global fish consumption, to consider resistance as a generative model for thinking about the agency of fish, and to consider it in relation to the instrumental of the violence visited upon fish, and to consider it in relation to the and to look at how that resistance has sometimes been forgotten or ignored, and at other times used against them. And Zoe Todd, in arguing that the bodies and movement of fish have mobilised and articulated resistance to colonial dispossession in northern Canada, has challenged us to relate to fish as cohabitants within the context of an oceanic consciousness, where oceans and waterways are our familiars and not a frontier or other space. And I think last night too, in thinking about Kirsty Dunn's wonderful presentation, just at the start too, in the way that Kirsty positioned herself at the start of the paper as te opori and te rarawa. She also discussed that very deep connection with fish, how fish and people help shape each other's identity. I called this paper, when I sent in an abstract a while ago, Sea Country Ruling the Waves and Histories of Fish in Uncertain Times. I'm not an expert on sea country, and I'm not here to talk about any fundamental or essential guiding principles of sea country. Why I think of sea country as a context for critically thinking about fish relationships was simply through what has been taught to me and spoken to me by colleagues. So it, probably rather than talking about sea country as a set of guiding principles or a set of ways of understanding about connections, it's also just the way sea country has been articulated in contexts in response to colonial practices. And in that way, I'm thinking specifically for me in terms of southwest Western Australian land claims, in particular the Hewitt land claim, also land claims in the Torres Strait Islands, which some of my students have been involved with, and also in a response to the assessment report put out by the Southeast Regional Marine Plan, which related to specific coastal sites in Australia, in South Australia, New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania. So it's that notion of sea country within that. I grew up obsessed with fish. It was just something that it was a topic that made me imagine another world, and I guess that's one of the things about wanting to understand fellow creatures who we can't fully understand as somehow unknowable, but wanting to know more and imagining a life that we can't actually live. My dad, as many people did in the late 1960s and early 1970s in Australia, maybe in Perth, maybe elsewhere, took an interest in tropical fish and kept tropical fish. Tropical fish was a big deal. People, talked about what fish they had, tried to keep them in as big tanks as possible. And for my dad, it was about connecting, I guess, with his childhood memories of growing up in Sri Lanka, then Ceylon, and the fish that he saw in the reefs around his home. So in a way, it brought back and stirred up memories for him, even though I think now, the idea of keeping tropical fish can be such a sad thing. It's about tropical fish seem to function as wallpaper in homes and public places. I was also interested in the whole idea. This is, I'm not trying to make, well, maybe I was a nerd, but thinking about the whole Devonian period and that notion of life emerging and under the water as well was something that interests me. So particularly that idea of the prehistoric world, and not just me, lots of kids love dinosaurs and that interest in dinosaurs, but I was also really interested in underwater prehistoric animals, and that idea that fish were ancestors of other forms of life. They came from other life, but in cells were helped to form that. And two groups of fish that particularly interested me at the time and that have somehow stayed with me ever since were lungfish and latimeria, or coelacanths, which I'll be talking about today. But first, lungfish. Queensland lungfish, or dulla, are endemic to the Mary and Burnett rivers in southeast Queensland. Fossils found in northern New South Wales indicate that dulla have survived for over 100 million years in rivers in eastern Australia. Dulla are distinct from other lungfish species in a number of ways. They have only one lung and breathe air only when forced to do so, such as moving between rivers as they dry up. Gubbi people, for whom the Mukulbulla or Mary River in southeast Queensland is country, see dulla as kin, eliciting an ethical demand for respect and protection. Humans and dulla are both part of the natural environment and as such are connected to each other. They share country, and Gubbi people do not eat lungfish. Audrey Appadurai argues that different cultural histories of lungfish reveal different frames of knowledge, different methodologies, and different ways of making meaning, where science can be seen as a cultural tool reflecting the society in which it operates. Inasmuch as they're capable of breathing air and or water, and are thus seen as suggesting a liminal subjectivity, lungfish provide a meaningful way of comparing different cultural approaches to understanding non-human life. In 1837, the Austrian zoologist Leopold Fitzinger described two lungfish specimens collected some years earlier by his compatriot Johann Natterer from a river in the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. Of particular significance was the fact that the fish each had what appeared to be a pair of lungs, with anecdotal evidence suggesting the fish were breathing air through them. The influential biologist and paleontologist Richard Owen had previously described a lungfish specimen collected from the Gambia River in West Africa, arguing that the fish's lungs were vestigial. And when I say collected from the Gambia River, we read that very easy phrase as a sign of colonial violence in history. Owen was a steadfast critic of theories of evolution. The examination and identification of the South American lungfish supported the suspicion that Owen was mistaken in his taxonomic pronouncement, and that lungfish were indeed a transitional species that evidenced an evolutionary link between fish and reptiles. The Queensland lungfish was introduced to Western science by the zoologist and director of the Australian Museum, Gerard Krefft. That was in 1870. Krefft was alerted to the existence of the fish by the notorious William Forster, former Premier of New South Wales. Forster was previously a pastoral squatter in Queensland and was believed to be responsible for the murder of a number of local Aboriginal men on or near the properties he had acquired. Upon examining a specimen of the lungfish supplied by Forster, Krefft was amazed and confounded by the single lung the fish seemed to possess. He immediately called for more specimens to be collected. His subsequent report, published initially in the Sydney Morning Herald, described the lungfish as an amphibian related to the South American and West African species. He expressed surprise that although the fish had been commonly seen by locals, they had not come to the attention of natural historians. Krefft named the lungfish Neoceratodus forsteri. He unequivocally claimed the fish as an Australian species rather than a British one, and positioned his findings squarely within the context of Darwin's theory of evolution. Peter Kind has described the announcement of the new species as sparking excitement and fervour in the scientific community, attracting large numbers of scientists to Australia, and we see that in terms of other writers talking about the period of the Queensland frontier. Despite calls from the Royal Society and the British Museum to send specimens to London amidst fears that colonial subjects would almost certainly kill all of them, the Australian Museum refused to defer to Britain as biological authority. As Aotearoa argues, this time the new Australian immigrants colonised the unique animals of the continent to establish their hold on the land. It had to be rediscovered to the Western world by Western colonists. Gubbi people's understanding of Dala as being able to produce both air and water precedes Western knowledge of lungfish and reinforces a conception of amorphousness in animal forms and shapes. Aotearoa suggests that lungfish's respiratory fluidity provides a point of tension for a colonial scientific order in a way that it doesn't for Indigenous people actually living with the fish. The struggles of colonial taxonomists can be seen as attempts to convert the discovery and enunciation of the fish into a sign of authority. In Australia, as was the case in South America and Africa, lungfish became a colonial animal. Its otherness was aligned with that of Indigenous subjects, both groups constituting a problem of knowledge and a problem of authority. While Gubbi people saw Dala as belonging to country, the lungfish were transformed by the colonial gaze into commodities. Many lungfish were captured and shipped to zoos and museums to be displayed. In 2017, and some of you have probably read about this, the Shed Aquarium in Chicago announced the death of Grandad, a Queensland lungfish estimated to be over 90 years old, who at the time was the oldest fish in any public zoo or aquarium in the world. He was one of a pair of lungfish that had been sent to be displayed at the 1933 World's Fair in Chicago before being moved to the aquarium. Coelacanths are large fish growing to between 1.5 and 1.8 metres in length, weighing between 60 and 100 kilos. Coelacanths have been present for at least 400 million years, with fossils from the early Devonian period found in Australian waters. Two species are known to survive today, the West Indian Ocean coelacanth and the Indonesian coelacanth. The main group of West Indian Ocean coelacanths is believed to live in the vast system of underwater caves beneath the steeply eroded volcanic slopes of the Comoros Islands at depths between 200 and 700 metres. They are sociable and often congregate in their caves, returning to their same home caves each day. The coastal waters in this area experience strong currents, and coelacanths are able to make use of oceanic upwellings and downwellings of the current to move around and hunt fish in open waters and to expertly negotiate the crevices and narrow passages of the caves with their numerous muscular pairs of fins and by electroperception. Comoran fishermen have shared the coastal waters with Gombessa, as coelacanths were and are locally known since at least the 6th century, avoiding catching them as they were recognised as not good to eat. The story of Western science's introduction to modern coelacanths is well known and provides the best known example of what has been described as a Lazarus taxon. In Old Forelegs, the story of the coelacanth, Professor James Leonard Brearley Smith, a South African chemistry professor and part-time ichthyologist, provides an account of how he became aware of the fish's continued existence. He'd received a letter and a sketch from a school teacher and part-time curator of the East London Museum, Marjorie Courtney Latimer, asking for help in identifying what she believed to be a coelacanth, caught off the South African coast near the Chalumna River in December 1938. Smith visited the museum in February 1939, confirming that the specimen was indeed a coelacanth, which he named Latimeria chalumna after the museum curator and the river where it was found. Smith's account of the discovery in Old Forelegs detailed the capture of the fish, the fishing boat captain's decision to contact Courtney Latimer, the curator's attempts to get the unwieldy specimen back to the museum, the lack of ice or refrigeration in the general vicinity, and the decision to stuff and mount the specimen, the contacting of Smith and his suspicion of the unlikely identity of the specimen, the enforced delay before Smith could travel to East London, and, as a climax, the moment when he first came into the presence of the specimen. And I'll quote him, "The caretaker ushered us into the inner room, and there was the coelacanth. Yes, God, although I had come prepared, that first sight hit me like a white-hot blast and made me feel shaky and queer. My body tingled. I stood as if stricken to stone. Yes, there was not a shadow of a doubt. Scale by scale, bone by bone, fin by fin, it was a true coelacanth. It could have been one of those creatures of 200 million years ago, come alive again." Each incident leading up to this encounter is related as the outcome of a miraculous chance, but also of destiny, reconnecting prehistoric time with modern time. Catching, identifying, transporting, mounting and classifying specimens are presented as extraordinary events, removed from the pattern of everyday life, represented as events of historic importance. If reviewed in the light of the political and social context of the Union of South Africa in 1938, however, the miracle seems less impressive. Despite comprising an ethnically and linguistically diverse country, legislation in the Union had formalised racial segregation and disenfranchised all black South African adults. The 1923 Urban Areas Act introduced racial segregation and provided cheap labour for industry led by white people. The 1926 Colour Bar Act prevented anyone black from practising skilled trades. The labour, and of course when I say labour, in a colonial context, it always means knowledge and experience. This labour involved in effecting the catching, identifying, transporting, mounting and classifying of the coelacanth specimen, and the regime enforcing the social hierarchy that privileges the enunciated and enunciating historical agents while silencing those subjected to the despotism of the regime are sublimated in Smith's account and in subsequent representations. The colonial order is assumed and justified in such a translation. The scientific monumentality of the event and the celebration of the coelacanth as a South African fish was subsequently brought into question by the identification of another coelacanth in the Comoros Islands in 1952. Since 1946, the islands had been recognised as a French overseas territory, with French colonial forces having had a presence there for a century beforehand. Smith had posted a reward for any coelacanth specimen found since his initial discovery and was immediately informed of the 1952 find. He made a covert trip to the islands to collect the specimen, hand over the reward, and this is an event narrated in heroic detail in Old Forelegs. The French government soon discovered the incident and, after shaking their fist at him, banned the taking of coelacanth specimens immediately afterwards. Over the next decade, the French government launched an intensive research campaign of its own in the Comoros, only then learning that Comoran fishermen had been aware of Gombessa for many, many generations. In 1998, another coelacanth discovery was announced, this time on the northern tip of Sulawesi in Indonesia. Canadian ichthyologist Mark Erdman had seen a coelacanth being wheeled by in a cart while at a fish market on his honeymoon. He immediately recognised the fish as a coelacanth, and being heavily influenced by Smith and his account, the fictional account within the book of that initial discovery, he got excited and photographed the fish and briefly interviewed the fisherman wheeling the coelacanth around. The announcement of the capture and preservation of a living coelacanth almost 9,000 kilometres from the Comoros appeared as a cover story by Erdman and colleagues in the journal Nature, and the discovery was also featured in the electronic and print media around the world. Discover magazine listed the discovery as one of the top science stories of 1998. Again, local fishermen and their families had long been aware of the fish, which they called Raja Lot, meaning king of the sea, but had not pursued it, as its flesh was considered to be very unpleasant in taste. They'd avoided it. Smith's and Erdman's stories of discovery take the form of narratives that open up the possibility of miraculous chance. They constitute a step away from what seemed to be an objective scientific description and a move towards the realm of wonder. It is in that moment and that movement that their accounts become open to reinterpretation. Other perspectives are suggested in that movement, other subjectivities are brought into contact with that of the narrator, and the authoritative nature of the story is brought into question. Today, both the African and Indonesian coelacanth populations have a strict range due to water temperature and food sources. In addition, they've become more vulnerable to capture as fishermen seek to sell specimens to scientists. No coelacanth has ever survived capture. As a result of these factors, the coelacanth populations are considered to be critically endangered, and conservation measures have been launched to attempt to protect them from extinction. Tunaku faru-faru, or New Zealand longfin eels, are the only endemic freshwater eel species in Aotearoa, and the largest freshwater eels in the world. They live the great majority of their lives in rivers and lake, and when ready, migrate to the open ocean in April and May to breed and die. Where precisely they go remains unknown. The fertilised eggs developed into tiny see-through creatures called leptocephali. These drift on ocean currents back towards the New Zealand coasts, developing into glass eels along the way. Between July and November, large numbers of the tiny glass eels enter waterways, where about a week later they develop dark skin pigment and become elvers. Elvers can climb straight up wet rock faces and other obstacles as they move further inland. Female tuna can grow up to 2 metres in length, weighing in excess of 20 kilograms, and live up to 100 years. Males are shorter in length and lead shorter lives. I've been told that doesn't matter, right? Historically, they have been the top predators of New Zealand river systems, occupying concealed places near riverbanks, rocks and logs during daylight hours, and emerging at night to hunt insect larvae, snails, fish, crayfish, and to take advantage of dead animals and birds in the river. Tuna hold a significant place in Māori cultural history, with many stories, artefacts and songs dedicated to them. They're also important nutritionally and economically, and they're an indicator of the health of rivers and the quality of water. Joseph Potangaroa identifies over 100 different tribal names for freshwater eels based on the subtle variations in their characteristics, which is representative of the extensive mataranga that exists. This knowledge emerged from the intense observation and interactions to determine the life cycle, habit needs and migration patterns, and guides Māori as to the sustainable take of a population. Eeling would also occur at special times of the month and the year, according to a range of environmental indicators. Tunaku faru-faru numbers have decreased in Aotearoa since the middle of the 19th century due to a variety of settler activities, including the clearing of native forests, the draining of swamps, the diversion of rivers, and the establishing of irrigation schemes. The introduction of trout and salmon as sport fish, initially by individual settlers and later by acclimatisation societies, also proved disastrous to tuna, as thousands of adults were killed both to make room for and eradicate a potential predator of brown trout. And in that, we see that idea, especially with acclimatisation societies, of brown trout as settling. There's something settling about, apparently, about killing a brown trout or hunting it in a way that isn't the case with eels, which are unsettling. The introduced trout then preyed upon the small eels left behind after the removal of the larger ones. In more recent times, the increasing threats to tuna include water poisoning from lead shot used by hunters, pollution from sewerage, dairy runoff, industrial chemical discharges, and the consequent loss of oxygen in the water. The building of dams and culverts has restricted access to the waterways traditionally used by eel on their migration journeys. 90% of pre-European wetlands have now been drained and thousands of hectares of forest have been cut down. At the same time, the past 50 years has seen a steady increase in commercial fishing. While Māori have customary take rights for cultural events, as well as a portion of the commercial take, some iwi have stopped or minimised the harvesting of eels, concerned by their dwindling numbers. In contrast to Māori knowledge of tūnāku wharu, European knowledge has been comparatively recent and scarce. They were observed by the German-born surgeon and naturalist Ernst Diefenbach between 1839 and 1841. Ernst Diefenbach happened to, and this is the nerd in me coming out, happened to be the observer who gave the first Western science description of the puriri moth, pipituna, which Kirsty critically reflected on in last night's talk. Diefenbach was working for the New Zealand Company, a chartered British company, ironic, tasked with establishing a business model based on property and labour organisation that would expedite the systematic colonisation of New Zealand. A specimen of the eel was collected by members of the Ross expedition, the Antarctic expedition, on their way back to Britain in 1842. The species received the scientific name Anguilla diefenbachia. One of the problems in considering the tūnāku wharu as a subject of Western science is the shape and pattern of their lives. While being born, entering the river and eventually leaving the river to spawn and die can be described and partly documented. The everyday lives of these eels, their knowledge and behaviour, evade closer surveillance. In addition, like many other groups of eels, the movement of tūnāku wharu in the open ocean is also largely unknown. David Wrighton, in a 2012 article in the Journal of Fish Biology, argued that eel migration continued to remain largely a mystery. Despite the use of marine remote sensing, genetic analysis, computer modelling and electronic tagging, clear knowledge about eel movements in the open ocean still eluded scientists and left researchers with a long series of questions. How do they achieve such incredibly long migrations? How do they metamorphose along the way? What do they do all day? Where do they spawn? Why there? How do they deal with changes in temperature? How do they deal with the hydrostatic pressure when swimming at great depths? Longfin eels, because of their size, have been able to be electronically tagged, although these tags will eventually pop off. But they have suggested a partial route past the northeast of New Caledonia and a rate of migration about 20 to 25 kilometres a day, but without a clear indication of spawning grounds. So while Māori knowledge of tuna life and relationships, their seasonal movement and their ecological and cultural importance has increased over generations by cohabiting, a Western scientific focus on taxonomy, hierarchy and fish biology has prevented a fuller sense of how eels live and their relationships with others. To the colonial gaze, lungfish, coelacanths and eels are strange, non-conforming, unsettling fish. We ask ourselves, how long have they known about us? And how have they eluded and continue to elude us? In each of the cases presented, groups of fish have been transformed into colonial subjects through their incorporation into specific and selective histories. As part of this subjectification, lungfish, coelacanths and longfin eel have experienced targeted violence in forms including increased commercial or trophy fishing, predation by introduced species, and habitat degradation as a result of plant and animal agriculture. In each example, power has been exercised in controlling the way in which fish are perceived, made sense of, and experienced. Catherine Youssef challenges us to pay attention to non-human animals inhabiting what she calls insensible worlds, subjects who we cannot meet on an even footing, and life that does not cooperate or seemingly cohabitate with us. She works on the premise that our models of attention, discourse, and ethics are shaped through aesthetic representational practices, arguing that non-human encounters are underpinned by a prior relationship with representation. Discrete authoritative acts of representation, including those of nomenclature, speciation, and archivization, subject non-human animals to the sovereignty of biological sciences. And to quote her, "The represented non-human subject is a thing caught between two worlds, as a life held in a space in which it cannot be held. In giving subjectivity, we take sovereignty. The thing is not as it would be on its own terms. Cryptic animals, by resisting surveillance and detection, also resist representation. They are more given to non-representational acts. By moving away from formal scientific description into the realm of anecdotal narrative, stories of discovery come into contact with alternative perspectives. The context in which each group of fish discussed becomes subjects of colonization is significant and revealing. Discovery as a historic sign foregrounds specific actors and events, rendering them as wondrous or miraculous, while concealing the social, cultural, and political relations that enable the event to be represented in that particular way. The context in which Gerard Krefft obtained his lungfish specimen, in which Marjorie Courtney Latimer and James Leonard Brearley Smith lay claim to the resurrection of the coelacanth, in which Ernst Diefenbach was able to observe long-finned eels, and for members of the Ross expedition to obtain a specimen for the British Museum, are not remembered as spaces, times, and social orders produced by colonial violence, despite that violence helping to establish the order, enabling the historic moment to be produced. They are, however, spaces of silencing as much as they are spaces of enunciation. The historic is simultaneously the quotidian and the unremarkable. In enunciations that seek to produce knowledge as authority, as controlling, as settled, contact with colonial subjects reveals competing versions of knowledge, other relationships and other conceptions of time and space, knowledges and relationships, both human and non-human, that precede and contain these enunciations. Inasmuch as we, as scholars, tell animal stories motivated by care and attention, Youssef calls for us to acknowledge the violence we have inherited in our relations with non-humans, arguing that shifting that visual or conceptual frame of ecological care, ethical concern, welfare, conservation, allows us to keep in mind our material connections with non-human animals. Distancing violence allows us as narrators not to be implicated in that violence, despite it being a primary mode of engaging and of the obtaining of knowledge. She suggests that the degree to which biotic subjects are subjectified is influenced by what is seen or unseen and how subjectivities are made and disclosed. What is described and narrated as a mystery, as part of the cryptic nature of some animals, suggests something other than merely surprisingly delayed or deferred discoveries. It's the all too likely possibility that coelacanths and lungfish saw us thousands of years before we saw them. Crypsis is not simply an inability to be detected or observed. It marks an excess in perception and experience. While long-finned eels, lungfish, and coelacanths are indeed nocturnal to varying degrees, camouflaged, and lead subterranean or deeply submerged lifestyles, including periods of dormancy, they each possess heightened sensory perception and awareness. Coelacanths and lungfish are both electroreceptive, possessing the ability to sense even minute changes in the electrical fields generated by oceanic currents. Long-finned eels have an excellent sense of smell, which is enhanced by tubular nostrils that stick out in front of their noses to help in hunting. They also have sensors on their sides and taste buds on their heads, and their skin is also highly sensitive, allowing them to sense what is around them in waterways. more than human awareness of human presence, provides a problem for colonial histories, suggesting a starting point that precedes colonisation and settlement, foregrounding the general achievements of species that have survived for millions of years in the face of countless threats. The three colonial histories of which I've provided very short, broad-brushed accounts suggest that what problematises official narratives of discovery as authoritative referential historic moments is a tension around time, space, and the completeness of subjectivity. As Patrick Wolfe has argued, settler colonialism works perpetually and always, never ending, towards the erasing of Indigenous people and culture. In Australia, it works to replace conceptions of an ancient settled space with that of a young and free white space, one which enables nature to be whitewashed as terra nullius, and in other contexts outside Australia, obviously, similar experiences and similar phenomena take place. Within the context of this whitewashing, the idea and principles of sea country, as it is understood, practiced and lived differently by different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups in Australia, disturbs colonial time and space, in part by incorporating knowledges and practices on land, now beneath the ocean, and in water, now reclaimed, that is, in spaces and times preceding and exceeding the historical and geographical borders of the nation. Sea country remembers specific sites of active coastal engagement between human and non-human animals, and specific moments of meaning-making in which coastal inhabitants gained knowledge and bore witness to the lives of each other. It's an idea that provokes and encourages us to imagine other stories and other perspectives, including those of fish who also precede and exceed us. Kia ora koutou.
So, a couple of very quick questions. Do we have some? You want to get in quick, because I certainly do. You'll have to wave at me. It's not easy to see with the lights. All right, I'm going to abuse my privilege here and ask. So, you talked about trying to understand fish, or seeking to understand fish as a young person, and being fascinated with that which is almost alien to us. I have this with cockroaches. So, but it also strikes me that our seeking to understand is often misused, that when we do understand, we categorise, we kill, we learn about them to harm them. Should we at some point stop trying to understand and simply seek to just be with?
I think, in a way, Nick, I think that questions lead to the idea. In terms of respecting difference, we also do need to respect distance. And that's about understanding that while space and time is shared, it's also discrete. And often, and I think this is part of a European history of knowledge, it's underpinned by the will to know, and those of you who are Foucauldians probably have written about this more than I have, or researched more about it. But that idea of the will to know often doesn't involve understanding those cultural borders, which are borders that exist to different groups of people, but also to different groups of non-human animals just as much. So I think, respecting difference means respecting distance as well.
Yeah, I agree completely. I'll just see if there are other questions before I continue. So, yes, just do a quick run, or a slow run even. So wave at me again.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was certainly enlightening. I do have a question regarding the lungfish in Australia. You mentioned that for the gabi-gabi, this fish is considered a king. There are certain restrictions in the consumption of this fish. Do you know, or are you aware if these prohibitions have informed governmental policies for the consumption of these fish for other type of settlers that are not indigenous?
No, I'm not sure. And certainly the history of Queensland lungfish is that they were seen as available, and squatters and other people near the rivers did consume them. Nowadays, because of environmental concerns, they are a protected species, but it doesn't mean that part of that history of knowledge didn't come from Italy. So, yeah, in terms of that, it's the idea that restrictions relate to a history of the European eating of the fish, and some of their names relate to their similarity to salmon, for instance. I think they're called Burnett River salmon by some people. So definitely there is a history of the
We are at time, so, one more, go on. We can. No, we can.
It's less of a question and more about that. So I thought one of the things that's really interesting to me towards the end, you talk about this idea of, especially with the eels, of these eels being there all this time, and they've been watching us, and we didn't even know they existed until, of course, people that lived with them did. And that kind of, strange feeling that we have about animals that we don't understand and that we don't know much about, or that we can't see, especially because of where they live, and we can't really, hold our breath that long. So, anyway, could you just talk a little bit more about that in terms of, in terms of anything that you'd like to talk about?
Especially, Carol, around that idea of unknowability. About unknowability specifically. I think it is partly about making noise halfway, of putting ideas out there to get a sense of an understanding, of sharing that idea of subjectivity. And just because, and I guess what I think some of the stories which I've talked about here, those contexts in which indigenous knowledge precedes and contains Western knowledge, but more importantly informs it, that Western knowledge is about following the paths already in place. There is a sense that more can be known because of living with, of spending time with, but there's always barriers to that. It's that sense that we cannot know all, and that's for some that must be very frustrating, but I think it's also a real thing. We cannot know. There are always barriers. There's stuff that we can't work with, and in terms of, part of it has to do with the fact that we don't breathe water. We don't know how to live in water, and as a result, and often that's something we don't take into account. Okay. Just before, I also just wanted to say, you've probably noticed that I was you probably thought that I was quite, assertive in speaking Māori words or whatever, and in fact I'm terrified. I said them, I'm sure I've pronounced them wrong. It was more about that idea, I guess in a sense, responding to yesterday, the idea as a visitor to Aotearoa and a non-Māori speaking person. Te reo Māori is a challenge. It's, I guess, disorienting and unsettling, and so I know I'm making an idiot out of myself by speaking those words, but it's actually a good thing. It's good for someone who professes to present knowledge, to have that, to be always challenged and unsettled by that. So I understand my inexpertness in relation to that.
Thank you. Thanks very much.